Have you ever walked away from a conversation feeling strangely drained, even though nothing bad really happened? Maybe it was just a quick phone call, or a visit that looked normal on the surface. But afterward, you felt tired in a way that sleep doesn't fix. You replayed things in your mind. You questioned yourself. You wondered if you said something wrong, or didn't do enough. If that sounds familiar, I want you to know something right away. You're not imagining it. As we get older, something very important begins to shift. Our time becomes more precious. Our energy becomes more limited. And our peace becomes something we can no longer afford to give away freely. And yet, many women, especially women who have spent their lives caring for others, carry a belief deep in their hearts: I should always be kind. I should always be there. I should always give. But what if I told you that not every situation calls for your kindness? And even more than that, what if I told you that sometimes continuing to be kind in the wrong relationships isn't love? It's actually a quiet form of self-neglect. Now, I know that might sound uncomfortable, especially if your faith has always taught you to be compassionate, patient, forgiving. And yes, those things matter. They matter deeply. But there is also something else God teaches us, something we don't always talk about: discernment, wisdom, boundaries. Because being kind doesn't mean allowing yourself to be used. It doesn't mean staying silent when your spirit is being worn down. And it certainly doesn't mean giving your last bit of energy to people who never pour anything back into you. In this video, we're going to talk about 5 types of people who often sit very close to us, who may no longer deserve the same access to your time, your energy, and your heart as they once did. Not because you've become cold, but because you've become wise. And I want to start with someone you may already recognize, someone who doesn't raise their voice, doesn't create drama, but still manages to leave you feeling smaller every time you're around them. You know her. She might be a friend you've had for years, a sister, a neighbor, even someone you love deeply. She's the one who always has something to say about your choices. Your clothes look different lately. Why would you do it that way? I wouldn't have made that decision. You're too sensitive. And at first, you might brush it off. You might even smile and tell yourself, oh, that's just how she is. Let me tell you about someone like this. Her name is Carol. She's 81, lives in a quiet neighborhood in Ohio, and every Sunday, she visits her cousin Diane. Carol brings a small pie, sits at the kitchen table, and tries to enjoy the afternoon. But almost every time, without fail, Diane finds something to comment on. You've gained a little weight, haven't you? I liked your hair better before. You really shouldn't spend money on things like that at your age. Nothing loud. Nothing aggressive. Just small comments. One after another. And for years, Carol told herself it didn't matter. Until one day, she noticed something had changed. She didn't feel excited to visit anymore. She started second-guessing simple decisions. She felt smaller. That's what a chronic critic does. Not in one big moment, but slowly, quietly, over time. They chip away at your confidence. They make you question yourself. And they often disguise it as honesty, or even care. But here's something I want you to hold on to. At this stage in your life, you have earned the right to feel comfortable in your own skin. You don't need to be corrected all the time. You don't need to explain your choices. And you certainly don't need to keep showing up for someone who makes you feel like you're always doing something wrong. Being kind does not mean being available for constant criticism. And sometimes, the most peaceful thing you can do is take a step back. Not with anger. Not with bitterness, but with quiet clarity. Now, let's talk about someone very different, but just as draining in their own way. This is the person who always needs something from you. Always. She calls, and before you even say hello, you already know it's not just to check in. It's a favor, a ride, a request, your time, your energy, your help. Let me introduce you to Linda. Linda is 72, and for most of her life, she has been the one everyone depends on. Her children, her neighbors, even distant relatives, they all know one thing. If you call Linda, she'll say yes. Need someone to watch the grandkids? Call Linda. Need help moving? Call Linda. Need someone to listen to your problems for an hour? Call Linda. And Linda, with her generous heart, always shows up. But something started to bother her. On her birthday, her phone stayed quiet. When she had a bad cold and stayed in bed for 3 days, no one checked in. When she needed help for once, there was no one there. And that's when it hit her. These relationships weren't built on love. They were built on convenience. Now, this is one of the hardest realizations, especially for women who have spent decades giving. Because part of you might say, but they need me. And another part might whisper, if I stop helping, will they still love me? But here's the truth. If someone only values you when you're useful, they don't truly value you. They value what you do, not who you are. And as you get older, your energy becomes something sacred. You don't have endless reserves anymore. Every hour matters. Every bit of strength matters. And giving it away to someone who only takes is like pouring water into a cup with a hole in the bottom. It never fills. It never comes back. And slowly, it drains you. You are allowed to say no. You are allowed to rest. You are allowed to choose yourself. And if someone pulls away because you stopped saying yes every time, then maybe they were never really there for you to begin with. Because real love doesn't disappear when you set a boundary. Real love adjusts. Real love respects. And real love gives back. Now, as you sit with that, I want you to gently think about your own life. Is there someone who leaves you feeling smaller after every conversation? Is there someone who only shows up when they need something? Just notice it. No judgment. Just awareness. Because awareness is where change begins. And once you begin to see those patterns clearly, something inside you starts to shift. You start to realize that it's not your job to carry every relationship. It's not your responsibility to keep everything smooth, to keep everyone happy, to keep saying yes just to avoid tension. And that realization can feel both freeing and a little unsettling at the same time. Because for so long, being the nice one may have been part of your identity. But let's take a moment and talk about another kind of person who makes that identity feel almost impossible to hold on to, the one who doesn't ask directly, doesn't criticize openly, but somehow still leaves you feeling uneasy. This is the person who operates in quiet ways. She smiles. She keeps her tone soft. She never really argues. But underneath that calm surface, there's something else going on. You might say something simple like, "I'm a little tired today. I think I'll stay home." And she responds with a gentle sigh, followed by, "Oh, I just thought we'd spend some time together, but it's fine." Nothing harsh. Nothing obvious. But suddenly, you feel like you've done something wrong. That's the passive-aggressive manipulator. Let me tell you about someone named Susan. Susan is 75, lives just a few houses down from her longtime friend Patricia. They've known each other for over 20 years. They share coffee sometimes, chat over the fence, exchange holiday cards. On the outside, everything looks warm and friendly. But Patricia has a way of communicating that leaves Susan feeling off balance. If Susan forgets to call, Patricia won't mention it directly. Instead, she'll say something like, "I guess we're all busy these days," with a quiet tone that lingers. If Susan declines an invitation, Patricia might respond with, "Don't worry, I didn't really expect you to come anyway." And when Susan finally gathers the courage to ask, "Did I upset you?" Patricia quickly smiles and says, "Oh no, you're imagining things." Now Susan is left questioning herself. Was that comment intentional? Am I overthinking? Did I hurt her? And this is where the real exhaustion begins, not in what is said, but in what is left unsaid. Because with passive-aggressive people, you're never quite sure where you stand. You start replaying conversations. You start walking carefully, choosing your words, trying not to trigger something you can't even name. And slowly, you begin to silence yourself. Not because you want to, but because it feels easier than navigating the confusion. And I want you to hear this clearly. At this stage in your life, peace is not a luxury. It is a necessity. You do not have to decode someone else's hidden messages. You do not have to accept subtle jabs wrapped in politeness. And you certainly do not have to keep explaining yourself to someone who refuses to communicate honestly. Kindness does not mean tolerating emotional games. It does not mean staying in situations where your spirit feels unsettled. Sometimes, the most graceful thing you can do is step back. Not to punish them, but to protect yourself. To create space where your mind can rest and your heart doesn't have to second-guess every interaction. And as you begin to create that space, you might notice something else. There are people in your life who don't use silence or sarcasm, but instead, they use something that can feel even heavier. Guilt. Now this kind of person doesn't raise their voice either. They don't argue loudly. In fact, they might come across as soft, even vulnerable. But they have a way of making you feel responsible for their feelings, even when you've done nothing wrong. Let me introduce you to Margaret. Margaret is 79, and she tries her best to stay connected with her family. She calls, she checks in, she offers help when she can. Her niece, Emily, reaches out often, but almost always when she needs something. And one afternoon, when Emily asks Margaret for a favor, Margaret gently says, "I'm a bit tired this week, sweetheart. I think I need to rest." There's a pause on the other end of the phone. And then Emily says, quietly, "Oh, I just thought family would be there for each other." That's all. No yelling. No anger. Just a sentence. But that sentence sits heavy in Margaret's chest long after the call ends. Suddenly, she's questioning herself. Am I being selfish? Should I have said yes? Am I letting her down? And this is what guilt-tripping does. It takes your kindness and turns it into an obligation. It takes your love and turns it into pressure. And over time, it teaches you to ignore your own needs just to avoid that uncomfortable feeling. You start saying yes when you mean no. You start overextending yourself. You start carrying things that were never yours to carry. And I want you to remember something important. You are not responsible for managing someone else's emotions at the expense of your own well-being. You are not unkind for needing rest. You are not selfish for setting limits. And you are not a bad person for choosing peace over pressure. Because real love does not punish you for having boundaries. It doesn't withdraw warmth just because you couldn't give more. It doesn't make you feel like you've failed simply for taking care of yourself. Real love understands. Real love respects. And real love does not leave you sitting in guilt long after the conversation ends. So the next time someone responds to your boundary with disappointment wrapped in silence or subtle words, pause. Take a breath. And remind yourself, you are allowed to stand firm. You are allowed to protect your energy. You are allowed to choose what you can give and what you cannot. And the right people, the ones who truly care about you, will not only understand that, they will honor it. And when you begin to stand firm like that, something quiet but powerful starts to grow inside you. A sense of steadiness. A sense of knowing. You stop rushing to fix every uncomfortable moment. You stop bending yourself into shapes just to keep the peace. And little by little, you begin to feel more like yourself again. Now, there's one more type of person I want to talk about, and this one can be especially confusing, because on the surface, everything looks friendly. There's no criticism, no obvious manipulation, no guilt. In fact, this person might even compliment you. They might smile, encourage you, tell you they're happy for you. But somehow, when you're around them, you don't feel fully at ease. There's a subtle tension, a quiet comparison, a feeling that your joy is being measured instead of shared. This is the secret competitor. Let me tell you about someone named Helen. Helen is 74, and after years of putting everyone else first, raising children, supporting her husband, managing a household, she finally decided to do something just for herself. She signed up for a local painting class. The first day, she was nervous. Her hands felt a little shaky, and she wasn't sure if she belonged there. But as the weeks went on, something beautiful started to happen. She began to enjoy it. She laughed with the other women. She felt proud of her progress. She started to feel a spark she hadn't felt in years. And then her friend Carol joined the class. At first, Helen was thrilled. She thought it would be nice to share the experience with someone familiar. But slowly, things began to feel different. Carol would look at Helen's painting and say, "That's really interesting, very bold for someone just starting." Or, "I love how free your style is. I've always been more focused on technique, but not everyone needs that." The words sounded kind, but something about them didn't sit right. Each comment left Helen just a little unsure of herself. And then came the comparisons. Carol would casually mention how the instructor praised her work. She'd talk about how quickly she picked things up. She'd share little successes, always with a smile, but somehow it made Helen feel like she was falling behind. And without realizing it, Helen started to shrink. She stopped talking about her own progress. She second-guessed her paintings. She wondered if she truly belonged in that room. That's what a secret competitor does. They don't tear you down openly. They don't criticize directly. They simply create an environment where you feel like you have to measure up, where your joy feels smaller, where your confidence quietly fades. And at this stage in your life, you don't need that. You've already spent decades proving yourself. You've already carried responsibilities, faced challenges, overcome things most people will never fully understand. You are not in competition with anyone anymore. And you shouldn't feel like you are. The people who truly belong in your life will celebrate your wins. They'll smile when you smile. They'll feel joy when you feel joy. They won't need to outshine you to feel secure. And if someone can only feel good when they're doing better than you, that's not friendship. That's comparison wearing a friendly face. And you are allowed to step back from that. You are allowed to protect your sense of self. You are allowed to choose relationships that feel warm, not competitive. Now, as you sit with all of this, the critic, the one who takes, the one who manipulates quietly, the one who uses guilt, and the one who competes, I want you to take a gentle moment and turn inward. Not to judge yourself, not to feel regret, but simply to notice. Are there people in your life who leave you feeling drained instead of peaceful? Are there conversations that make you feel smaller instead of supported? Are there relationships that feel more like obligation than connection? If the answer is yes, that doesn't mean you've done something wrong. It means you've been kind. It means you've been giving. It means you've cared. And those are beautiful qualities. But now, it's time to pair that kindness with wisdom. Because your later years are not meant to be spent fixing everyone else. They are meant to be lived. They are meant to be felt. They are meant to be protected. You have the right to decide who gets access to your time. You have the right to choose who you answer the phone for. You have the right to say, I don't have the energy for this anymore. And you don't need to explain yourself to everyone. You don't need to justify every boundary. You don't need to earn the right to rest. Sometimes, the most loving thing you can do is step back quietly. Not with anger. Not with resentment. But with peace. With clarity. With the understanding that you are no longer willing to trade your well-being for someone else's comfort. And I want to leave you with this thought. Being kind does not mean being available to everyone. It does not mean saying yes when your heart is tired. It does not mean staying in relationships that slowly wear you down. True kindness, real, healthy, lasting kindness, includes yourself. It means honoring your limits. It means protecting your peace. It means choosing relationships that give as much as they take. So if something in your life has been weighing on you, if there's a relationship that doesn't feel right anymore, trust that feeling. You've lived long enough to recognize what drains you and what restores you. And you are allowed to choose what restores you. If this message spoke to your heart in any way, I'd love to hear from you. You can share your thoughts or your experiences in the comments. Sometimes, just putting it into words can bring a sense of clarity, and you never know who else might read your story and feel less alone because of it. And if you found this helpful, go ahead and like the video and subscribe to the channel Elderly Faith Journey. There's so much more we're going to talk about, real conversations, real guidance, and real encouragement for this season of life. Because no matter your age, it is never too late to protect your peace, to choose yourself, and to live with the kind of quiet strength that comes from knowing your worth. Here's to softer days, lighter hearts, and a life surrounded by people who truly see you, respect you, and meet you with the same kindness you've given so freely. You deserve nothing less.